When people start responding to jokes by saying like, well, I don't know if he's got his facts right, then something's gone horribly wrong.
Marc Maron, Consequence Comedian of the Year. Welcome.
Thank you.
Like a lot of people, I struggled with the Riyadh Comedy Festival.
Well, there's a Riyadh Comedy Festival. I don't know if you heard about that.
Do you think there's an amount of money where you might have been tempted to say yes?
No, not me.
You don't seem to put much stock in the argument that those people are engaging in conversations that help change that culture?
People who grew up in autocratic countries that become culturally westernized, I don't think ever changes the politics of those countries. It just does what it does here, creates more distraction, a sense of freedom of choice because you have a few different restaurants and a few different places you can go online. But I mean, I don't know, show me the evidence. It's not helping us right now. I just don't see the argument. So they got American comedy there. How does that change anything other than, look what we did for you. Isn't this fun? It's about money, dude. Can you rationalize taking that money? And most people can, because that's the world we live in. And I'm not even on any kind of high horse. I get it. Hey, all money's shitty. Take it while you can. You know, my joke was not, it was just calling out a reality. It was there to be seen. And if you can rationalize taking the money and live with that, then that's how this world works. You know, we live in a world where our president, who's supposed to be an example of something American, might be the most American president we've had in years. In terms of what people think, get away with what you can get away with. Get all the money you can. Double down on anything. You know, don't take responsibility or apologize for anything. I think that what you see with both that Riyadh joke and with the Theo joke is that, you know, structurally and in terms of comedy, they're solid jokes that became bigger because of what they implied and what they said and what they were satirizing or criticizing culturally. And that is really what the idea of free thought and taking a real risk in culturally taking on forces that, you know, represent power. The power of a real joke that does have an edge to it is different than just repeating, you know, crass tropes and picking on certain marginalized cultures because that's supposed to imply some sort of great risk taking. I've done all the kinds of jokes. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. And, you know, over the course of my career, I've done a lot of wrong-minded jokes, you know, for effect and for reaction that over time I learned, you know, were not really necessary or particularly appropriate and you know, made, you know, hurt people or represent things wrong. And this is part of evolving as a person and becoming wiser. I come from this with all firsthand experience. I'm not some radical progressive ranting about political impropriety. I'm a comedian. So when I said what I said about the comics in terms of what was happening in Austin and around that sphere of comics and that audience, was just to really make a point because of their cultural momentum and their presence that they don't get to dictate, you know, what comedy is, because they've created this audience of what was primarily not comedy fans and created this new breed of, you know, pseudo-radicalized comedy fans around anti-woke comedy. What's interesting about comedy and what is great about it is that it is an expansive bunch of voices, both vulnerable and angry. And there was just this thing that was happening where they were getting or assuming the last word about what comedy was. And it was fairly unnuanced and very hackneyed in terms of its repetition of two or three ideas that were primarily right-wing talking points. So that was why I did that. It was for comedy, not for me, not for the left. It was for comedy.
Is there a frustration with outsiders, maybe like me, reading too much into the jokes?
Run with it. I don't care if you read into it. You know, the joke, it's like a poem. You're going to sit here and you're going to question E.E. Cummings or Wallace Stevens. You're going to be like, you know, what did you mean? When people start responding to jokes by saying like, well, I don't know if he's got his facts right, then something's gone horribly wrong. Is Joe Rogan still a comic, or is he some sort of lifestyle show that deals with information barter? I don't know. You know, jokes have meaning. Jokes imply things. Jokes, you know, can make you look at things differently. differently. But, the fact is that not unlike the anti-woke crew, you do get to say their jokes.
You talked about some of the different kinds of jokes that you don't tell now. I'm curious in what ways you think you have gotten better as a comedian recently.
It becomes a point of, why are you doing a particular joke? Everybody goes through phases of this or that. It's nice to get a rise out of people. It's nice to, shock people. It's nice to take risks to create that electric feeling of like, oh man, I can't believe he's saying that. Eventually that has to wear off and you have to decide, what are you thinking about? What are your thoughts? Are they your thoughts? What do you know from your experience? How much vulnerability are you going to make yourself available to in this particular creative form? Like comedy is what, I do with my life and it is my method of expression. And as I grow, hopefully as a person, that, you can kind of create a depth around this stuff. So, moving away from just getting a rise out of people or being shocking or saying things just to say them because they make people go like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. As I get older, you can go deeper than that. And because of that, I'm not a particularly popular comedian. I've never been a particularly popular comedian. I have carved out my own space in this world of comedy, but it is what it is. And, I can't do it any other way, but I just try not to take the cheap shots if I can avoid it. I just have to assume that if I'm going to look at this, and I rarely do, as an art form, that, evolution and depth is available. It's possible. It's a willingness to put yourself on the line for that stuff in the way that I do. Like, because I get pretty open and I do share things that have, powerful implications for me and for other people. Over time, I've learned I'm not for everybody, but my heroes weren't either. So that's that.
You write jokes across the political spectrum about people across the political spectrum. Does it feel the same crafting those jokes? Is it just craft?
There is a way to address politics from my point of view. I made a shift many years ago to only speak of my experience as much as possible, my point of view, because then there's less of a risk of having similar jokes to other people. I mean, a lot of stuff in people's lives, like the mundane is common experience. So that's going to happen. But in terms of my thinking in a specific way relative to the news cycle, I'd never want to be, a puppet to that shit. When I talk about politics, I think, which I do in certainly the last three specials, there is a section where I do that. And I try to make it relatively broad so it doesn't just become dated immediately. But I had a pretty good shot and the timing was right for Panicked because, we're going to be in this shit for at least 4 years. So whatever I talked about in broad strokes in that was probably going to hold. And also my choice to sort of take liberals to task as well for their idiosyncrasies, which I think gave it a nice balance. But heading into that material, I changed the tone of that material a week before. I realized that if you come in hot on this stuff, it's very hard to get out from under, especially when you're dealing with more liberal or progressive politics, to not sound self-righteous. So going into the first piece, I literally changed the tone of it.
What led you to that conclusion?
There's no structural process going on from pen to paper with me. I have ideas. Sometimes I'll write, notes about ideas, but rarely do I write jokes. So what happens is all of this stuff evolves on stage through speaking. It's improvisational to a certain degree. Punchlines for jokes in the special, a couple of very big ones, happened, a week before, because I remain fluid, I remain open. And the editing process from moving it from an hour and 45 to 70 minutes takes place, only a couple of weeks before I do the special, 3 weeks maybe. And then I commit to that set and I repeat the set that I've edited until it's locked in. But it's still, and by doing it that way, you're literally dealing with a fresh set. You're going from an hour and 45, and then you're like, all right, this has got to go. You're pulling out chunks. You're reordering it. You make a list of the order. You see how things connect. And then for 2 or 3 weeks, you're doing a completely new set to you and to everybody else. So it becomes fresh again, although the jokes within it are well polished. And in that space, I got a big line from the special. It was delivered to me a week before, after working with the sort of balance of being, a liberal-minded person and, our own foibles and our own idiosyncrasies. And then the line that says we annoyed the average American into fascism.
Yeah.
That happened a week before the special, dude.
Progressive
progressives have really got to figure out how to deal with this buzzkill problem. You do realize we annoyed the average American into fascism.
You said you try to stay open to improvisation. Were any moments in the special, as you can remember, actually improvised on stage?
There are probably a couple little ones. It was tighter and more grounded than I've ever been. And the total shift made a big difference, because I started to think about, like, if I'm going to open with this stuff, if I come in hot, it's going to have a built-in condescension to it.
And what were you? Sorry, what were you coming in hot? It was about politics, or what do you mean you were coming in hot?
I just mean to sort of like, oh, everything's great. How much greater is this going to get? As opposed to like, yeah, everything's great.
So you didn't rearrange the material so much as change the presentation of it.
Just that opening bit to make it more like, how can anyone see this differently? There's an irony to it, but there's not an anger to it.
In the special, you joked that you were going to get a couple of emails. Did anybody email you after the special?
Yes, like it was around the word retard, and I knew that the liberal sense of humor is not great. They're going to focus in on no bad word without contextualizing it. That's a delicate joke. A lot of these jokes were very hard to balance and very hard to work out. It takes a lot of work to find the tone that's going to make that stuff land and not make people horrified or sad.
Why do you think that liberals default to being humorless scolds?
They're passionate, sensitive people, and they believe in a better place than is really possible, I think, sometimes. And I think they get locked into very singular and very sort of the minutia of causes. I don't think they enable themselves much wiggle room, because I think they think that making it funny undermines the righteous purpose that they're trying to enact. Making liberals laugh at themselves in that first chunk of the special was important.
What do you think actually works to get through to people?
What happens in between people and in the space of actual reality is sometimes very subtle, it's sometimes very fragile, and it's really not that big a mystery. People, when they're not lit up, by their phones, they're okay, and they're fragile, and they tend to care innately about other people, and usually are carrying a lot of weight in their own hearts that they don't know how to handle. It comes out in little places, but there's a real poetic beauty to the pace of genuine interaction and the time frame of reality. But I don't think most people's minds or attention is operating in that space anymore. And I don't know what you do about that.
Do you see positives within this, like, sort of digital culture too, or are you also sort of down on it?
You can't just say like technology sucks, but the mind always has been fairly fragile and very easily impressionable. The brain is basically a recording device. And what goes into your eyeballs, into your brain, can fairly quickly, it can shatter your ability to function in a human way because of what it does to your brain. I'm doing a bit now about, average daily screen time. The fact that it is all consuming and completely addicting, and the pace of how it operates in terms of the brain chemicals that we have is inhuman. But I think humans' nature is just to adapt to it and, be absorbed by it, and then eventually become an appendage of it. It is not an appendage of you. It is not a tool. I did a joke a million years ago in 1995 about the internet. The punchline turned out to be incorrect, but the observation of somebody when it first started happening, the internet, and, people spending all this time on it. And the guy was like, what are you doing? You're wasting your whole life on the internet. And the guy says, yeah, but the computer's a tool. And I'm like, no, it's not. You're a tool. It's using you. So I think that was true.
You're a tool. It's using you.
One of the parts of the special that spoke to me the most was about dementia. And I'm curious if you found it easy or important to mine the humor out of that, if it changed your own relationship with your own mind. What was that experience like?
Well, no, it's scary, am I going to get that? I mean, that's the basic fear about anything, cancer, dementia, MS, who the fuck knows? You can run with all that stuff. My buddy Jerry always says, there's something in the mail for everybody. It's terrifying, the possibility of having it. But, in engaging with it with my father, and given that, my relationship with my parents is not bad, but it's not, as connected or respectful, or has it ever been, as some other people's, it gave me a little bit of leeway to, explore those jokes without fear of offending my dad or my mom or other people, because I think that the experience, no matter what my relationship is with my parents, is now a very common experience. And it's a very hard experience. And I do think it's an opportunity to get to know, a loved one in a way that has a at times poetic honesty. And, bits and pieces come out of context that are very revealing about them. And if they are a parent, you.
It sounds like you think about jokes like the way somebody might construct a sandcastle. Like it's there for a moment, but it's not supposed to last.
For me, once the hour is done, it's done, but it lives on. And that's just good poetry, right? I think jokes can last forever. Sometimes they get dated, but other times they reflect, constant of the human experience,
In the special, the joke was that you didn't think you would last and maybe didn't care. Does some part of you hope that your legacy is maybe a little more robust than you were joking about?
Relevance, in the media landscape we are in is very fleeting. It's an ego thing about the impact one makes. It's me just sort of, trying to accept my journey, and my ceiling and the limit of my relevance as I see it in relation to the world we live in. Being somebody who is very famous to very few, it's just interesting, and I've always sort of played with that you can, walk through life and some people are like, oh my God, it's Marc Maron. And the person they're with is who? It's just the way it is.
Do you tend to get recognized in some places more than others?
New York, with people walking down the street, they see me and they got their AirPods on. They're like, I'm listening to you right now.
What does that sensation feel like?
It's just a conversation starter. The familiarity, I just take for granted. When people are like, Maron, I'm like, how's it going? I guess it's flattering. For me, it's more, connection, like, oh, cool.
When you think back over the 1,600 episodes, which ones pop into your head first as, oh, that was a good one, or oh, that was fun?
There were ones that were sort of important to me. William Friedkin, Albert Brooks, a lot of the directors, some of the Keith Richards, some of the actors. People become human pretty quickly, but I was pretty excited about getting to hang out with them, especially old guys, who have been through a lot. Those are always pretty good ones.
Have there been times where you felt like you were walking into the middle of a conversation someone's having in their head with you, and you're like, I just got here?
Well, yeah, but I knew that was true. So that's not really a problem, because if you listen to the podcast, you do know a lot about my life. So if someone out of nowhere says, like, did you ever get that thing fixed at the house? Or, how's Charlie doing? I'm like, yeah, it's okay. It's still at work. I'll go ahead and continue the conversation for a minute or two. I'm not going to spend the day with them generally.
Last question as we're running out of time. Could you please give us just a little bit of a sense of what's coming up?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just doing the comedy work. And then, I'm hoping to get this movie off the ground. We've begun that process of making a film out of my buddy Sam Lipsyte's novel. Maybe that'll become a movie that I will direct. I've got another season of Stick for Apple TV, shooting in a couple weeks. I've been playing some music here and there, but just for fun. All the things I always did, except for the constant grind of putting 2 new podcasts up every week.
Do you see yourself ever performing music publicly?
I have been. I don't like not being good at something. And I think that I'm pretty good. I can express myself okay, on guitar, but my singing could use some work. But there's only one way to get better, and that's to do it. So, I guess I don't have to post it on Instagram. I can just see it. But I've been playing out with some musicians a bit, over the last few years. And I got a new group of musicians I'm working with now. But I'm not where I want to be. And it's not quite fun yet because I'm not quite where I want to be. But it's okay.
Any music you've enjoyed this year?
Well, I like that band Geese, but I guess I'm not alone in that.
What did you like about Geese, if I may ask?
Well, I think that there are certain bands, and they're rare, that, without trying, kind of insert themselves into a legacy of real rock. And, that there are certain things that you can hear in there that may seem like, familiar from whatever got them to where they are in terms of music, but they elevate it in some other way. And they've got their own angle on something I think is pretty traditional and, a little bit lacking in a general sense across the board of originality, rock music. But I think they're a rock band, and it's hard to just be a rock band and be like, holy shit, they really rock hard. And, that's a rare thing, and they kind of do it. The new Geese record, that first cut is pretty crazy because, it's rhythmically interesting. I mean, like right out of the gate, they're like definitely informed by something, Caribbean, but then it turns into some other thing, and it just runs the whole spectrum of all the things that come together to make rock music, I like it.
Thank you so much, Marc. I really appreciate your time and
Yes,
you
sir.
talking to us today.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thanks for the honor.